Welcome. I'm Kowa, and you're listening to the Dear Diaspora podcast. Dear Diaspora exists to host meaningful Africa-centered conversations about all things culture, business, mental health, politics, and more. Join me and guests as we ask the big questions, challenge narratives surrounding Africa, learn and unlearn, and explore what a more connected, collaborative, and engaged African diaspora can look like. Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to episode 5. I cannot wait for y'all to listen to this episode. I was joined by Yeve Sibanda. She's an attorney, public speaker, and author of the children's book, my first book of Shona and Ndebele words. Before we get into the episode, don't forget you can now support the show by buying us a coffee. Be as generous as you'd like. All of your support goes right back into growing the podcast and supporting the creatives behind the show. Yeve is a native Zimbabwean who calls the United States her adopted home. She wrote this book to help keep Indigenous African languages such as Shona and Ndebele fun, alive, and interesting. During the episode, we chat through how not being allowed to speak her Indigenous languages at school back in Zimbabwe impacted her language journey, how she's teaching her American-born daughter, Shona and Ndebele. She provides tips for current and future parents on having a multilingual household and setting realistic expectations. And I also share a bit about my language journey and background and how I'm finally getting around to officially practicing and intentionally learning Tonga, my native language. I was actually able to find a tutor on Facebook, and we meet twice a week via WhatsApp and Google Meet, and it's just been the most amazing thing, and I feel so much more confident speaking it, and it's so great to just have someone to ask all the questions about grammar and vocab and tenses and all the things. So definitely a gift to be able to do that. And that's why I love this conversation with Yeve so much, because she aims to empower and inspire all of us to embrace our rich heritage. Here is our conversation. Yeve, welcome to Dear Diaspora. I'm so excited to have you as a guest.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here, Dua. I've waited for this for a long time, as you know, so this is great. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Looking forward to chatting about all things language and your really cool book and just getting to know you more. So let's get started by, getting to know you more. Where are you from and where did you grow up?
Absolutely. So I am from Zimbabwe, and I grew up in Zimbabwe, in Harare specifically. That's where I was born and raised, the capital city. Shout out to Harare. And I then moved to the US when I was 16 and have lived outside of Zimbabwe ever since then. And so now I call the US home. Zimbabwe obviously always is home, but I call the US home now, as that's where my husband and I are raising our family.
Wow, beautiful, beautiful. So I'd love to hear more about, what was it like? You said you came to the US when you were 16. How was that transition for you, first of all?
It was a culture shock. I won't lie, especially coming from the capital city of Zimbabwe, I moved to Orangeburg, South Carolina, which is a very, very small city in South Carolina. And I went to an HBCU, so a historically Black college and university. It was just a bit of a culture shock for me. I think the media does a really good job of portraying the US in one particular way. And when I came here, that was not the experience I had. I had visited before I moved, but I had never obviously lived in the US. And so there were a lot of things that were new and unfamiliar. And there were a lot of things that were similar too, but still it was at that age, if you can imagine being a teenager, it was a culture shock. But we got through it and here we are.
Wow. I always think about that. I'm always, because I came to the US when I was 10. So I'm always like, would it have been an easier adjustment if I was, older, younger? I'd imagine being a teenager, that's such a tricky time because then it's like you care about what people think.
Mhm.
I just, yeah, and the perceptions people have about, Africa,
Oh yeah.
I'd imagine that's that's a very difficult time to, completely just be in a different part of the world.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that about, imagining if it would be more difficult or less so. Because I go through the same thing as well. And I think about that. I'm like, if I had moved when I was 20, or if I had moved when I was younger, like what was that? What would that have been like? And obviously, I wouldn't take any of it back. But it is just an interesting kind of discussion I have in my head sometimes.
Mm, same. Yeah, I think about it often. And I feel like what I admire about some of my peers and friends who've relocated to the US as maybe teenagers or they're in college, I feel like they have just a better sense of self, or just this confidence that they just exude. They know where they're from, understand their culture, they speak their language. So I really admire that, because I feel like coming to the US when I was so young, it's like you just quickly want to assimilate and kind of
Yeah.
blend in. And,
Yeah.
that sense of identity isn't like really, it's not really that strong when you're, younger. So,
It's I hear what you're saying, and I think as you're saying that, I was just thinking, I think there's probably like a spectrum, right? Because 10 is super young, like you said, and I mean that's middle school, and middle school is tough. And you don't want to be the kid sticking out in middle school, and so I completely get that. 16 is a little older, but I feel like you're just starting to, at least I was just starting to kind of understand who I was. And I actually had my journey of like self discovery and all of that once I was here a little bit more, because I was forced to really answer the question of who are you? Where are you from? And that probably wouldn't have happened had I stayed in Zimbabwe. I probably wouldn't have had to deal with it in the same way that I did when I was now here, right? But I still, like you, I still had those moments of like, wanting to fit in and all of that because I was 16. So I wasn't that much older than you. So I think there's like a scale. That's what I meant, a scale, not a spectrum, but a scale. And so I feel like, 16. And then if you look at someone who's 18, they probably are a little bit more removed. But then when you look at someone who's 25, yeah, absolutely. That's completely different than 10, than 16, right? And so it just is like little movements on the scale, but I think it's all part of the same thing. I think anytime that you are um, placed in a new environment, those things are going to come up no matter how old you are. I think it's just the intensity of it differs depending on how old you are, right?
absolutely, absolutely. Growing up in Zimbabwe, did you speak your local languages? And how did that shift once you moved to the US?
That's a great question. So growing up, yes, I spoke Shona, which is the language that my family speaks. I'm Shona. And so I spoke Shona. And I'll answer it in two parts. So I spoke Shona growing up. As far as the other national languages, there's 15 others. Shona and Ndebele are the two primary. However, growing up in Harare, the capital city, the center of everything, power, we were not taught the other languages in school. We were taught Shona. That's it. And so there was no choice but to learn Shona. Like you couldn't elect to say, "Hey, I want to learn Ndebele," or that wasn't a choice. And so, by the nature of how the education system was set up, by the nature of most people living in Harare speaking Shona, in addition to English, obviously, but like I just learned Shona, right? And how that changed when I got here, obviously, I'm not around people who are speaking Shona anymore. And so my Shona usage goes down, right?
Hmm.
And so I'm only speaking Shona when I'm talking to other people who speak Shona. It's not it's not a thing that I'm doing all the time. And even when I was in Zimbabwe, and this is the second part of the question, or the second part of my answer rather, I grew up in a time in which it wasn't it wasn't cool to speak your local languages. People didn't, like my peers, at least in the schools that I attended, the neighborhoods I grew up in, it really, I think probably starting around maybe like third or fourth grade, I think maybe. I'd have to go back and like assess properly, but like there was definitely a point at which it wasn't cool among my friends to speak Shona, and it was very, very much amplified in high school. I went to a private all girls boarding school in just outside of Harare, and there, you know, we most of us spoke Shona, or grew up in homes where that was the primary local language, in addition to English, obviously. And yet, like, there was this like, oh, it's not cool to speak Shona, and so that was weird. But that's like the time that I grew up. You know, that's the time in which I grew up, and even at that school, there were some teachers who wouldn't let you speak Shona, you know, and so that really, I mean, if you can, we're talking about, you know, being a teenager and what that's like as a teenager, the message that sends to you is that English is the language of preference, right? And English is the language of intelligence and communication, and everything else is secondary. And so what happened to me, and I think to others, my friends, is we then really didn't like, we didn't really listen to local music, like local artists. We loved pop culture and all that. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? But there was no reinforcement of like some of the local artists. For example, one of my favorites, may he rest in peace, all of them Tukudzi, right? That's not stuff that we listened to in high school. However, once I got here, going back to the point about self-discovery, oh, did I listen to all of that stuff? I listened to it like it was, I went like the complete opposite direction, right? I knew all the words and I'm like, what, where have I been? Why haven't I been listening to this? And yeah, so there was that shift, I think, because now I was placed in an environment where I was forced to grapple with that, and I was forced to appreciate and really learn for myself. So that's my long two-part answer to your question.
Wow. I mean, I definitely relate to a lot of what you said. And I'd say, I mean, even though I was only, you know, in school up to grade 5 back home, I never learned a local language in school. Like that just wasn't part of the curriculum. But I'm learning now, like through my little cousins and stuff, that they actually are learning local languages like Nyanja, for instance. So that's happening. And I've heard all the time that, like, you know, certain schools, like maybe government schools, would teach local languages. But I went to a private school and I just wasn't exposed to that. And I do remember specifically, you know, teachers, administrators saying things like, you know, you can't speak, you know, vernacular, or you can't speak vernacular, which is like, I think is used to describe Nyanja, for instance, or anything that just wasn't English. Yeah, it's like you couldn't speak those things, and, you know, you'd be like redirected if they heard you, you know, not speaking English. And so it's just crazy to think that, you know, that was the norm, and, you know, it continued on because, you know, people would be shamed, you know, if you don't speak English, you know, perfectly, or, you know, whatever, then you look like, oh, you're not as intelligent, or yeah, you're just shamed for it, which to me just doesn't make sense. Like in an African country, especially, like, why aren't we making sure that people are speaking native languages in addition to English? Like, it just makes you a more well-rounded person. And yeah, I just never really understood why that was the case. Did you move to the US like with a parent, or by yourself?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I
Wow.
had family here though. So but I moved by myself. And yeah, I mean that was a whole, I could write a book about that too.
Mm.
But yeah, I think I want to touch on something that you said just now. And I've thought about this so often. Why on earth would the experience of people who live in an African country be people like our age, even though let's just say millennials, right? Why would that be the experience? And I've talked to a number of people about this, and I think part of the answer comes down to colonization. Colonization did a number. And as we know, having lived in the US as long as we have, the effects of slavery, for example, in this country are real and they are systemic, okay, from every facet of life: housing, financial services, education, every facet of life. They are systems that were put in place for a reason. Colonization, similarly, had systems.
Mm.
And one of the things that was done during colonization is exactly what we were talking about, right? To teach that English should be the norm.
Mm.
English is the official language of most countries in Africa. Why? Because the British colonized us, right?
Mm.
Um, and so that is part of the reason. And colonization didn't end when the colonizers left, right? It continued because the systems were there. And then there's the told or unseen effects of colonization, which is colonization of the mind, right? Like Bob
Mm.
Marley says, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. That, I think, is why we have a lot of the stuff that we see today, is because mentally we were still and are still in some respects colonized. And so that's kind of my assessment there. Maybe unpopular, but that's what I think.
But it's facts. It's facts. Um, yeah, and I think, especially like, here people say things like with regard to like immigrants from like Latin American countries, it's like just because I don't speak English doesn't mean I'm not smart, right? Like I just literally don't know your language. And I really wish we could look at the fact that so many Africans speak multiple languages. We're polyglots. Like that's like the average person, especially in my home country, the average person speaks at least three,
Mm-hmm.
three local languages plus English. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like, you know, just because I'm not fluent in English doesn't take away from the fact that I'm actually able to communicate and, with different people in so many different
Mm-hmm.
ways.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, colonization definitely did a number. And yeah, I just hope that we continue to really value our own languages and just how important it is to preserve them. Especially you've been in the US for quite some time, and you shared earlier that um you married a fellow Zimbabwean. I'd love to hear maybe just a little bit about how you actually ended up meeting someone from your home country.
Oh wow. When this episode is released, I have to send it to my friend Rumbi because she will love this and eat this up. So I met my husband through my friend, Rumbi. Her and I went to high school together, and she like me, moved to the US. She moved after her A levels and she moved to the US and she lived in Mississippi. I was um and she did college and undergrad there. And when I came back from the UK, I really urged her, hey, you need to leave Mississippi, because she hadn't lived anywhere else. And I said, you need to leave, come on here, and we'll find you a job, we'll figure it out, you'll stay with me, whatever. And so it turns out she actually had other family here. And so she moved. And when she did, she reconnected with her cousin, my husband. And when they
Ah.
reconnected, she was like, I think there's a guy, my cousin, I think you would like him. He's a really cool guy. And the rest is history.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah,
That is
yeah,
so awesome.
yeah,
Um, and so then, you married a Zimbabwean,
yeah.
and then he speaks which languages? He speaks
He
Shona.
speaks Shona and he speaks Ndebele.
Mm, mm.
Yeah,
And so how has that been now that you guys have like a daughter?
yeah,
Are you speaking Shona and Ndebele with her, or how does that work?
yeah, yeah. So I I have talked and thought about this quite a bit because with my book, I really intended to have a resource for us to be able to teach her the two primary languages that we speak, and also I wanted to capture and have a book that could stand on her library that kind of celebrated where she was from, right? Because to our point about being an immigrant in this country, like there's identity and all of that, and obviously she will have a different experience than you and I had, because she was born here, she's American, but she's also African, she's Zimbabwean, right? And so we wanted to be very intentional about that. And so the book is there excuse me, the book is there as a guide. And you shared earlier yourself about when you have kids, you want them to at least understand, right? Not for fluency. And that's exactly how I feel. I don't intend, or I don't expect, rather I don't expect her to become fluent in Shona or Ndebele, but I want her to know and be able to communicate. And so how we've approached it, and we continue to pivot and tweak and whatever, but we speak to her in Shona and Ndebele, but we also speak to her in English, because she hears English everywhere, right? On television, she's hearing English. At school, she's hearing English. And so what we've observed is that she is a little bit more confident in English. And sometimes she'll even say, like, if we say a word in Shona, she'll say no, and she'll say the English word. And
Uh-huh.
so I've already seen that as she's gotten older, she's becoming more conscious about the fact that these languages are different. No one has
Mhm,
taught her that, but it's just her own,
mhm,
she's learning that. And so I don't want to push her away by like forcing it down her throat.
mhm,
I just want to continue to speak and letting her kind of, you know, process it in the way that she processes it. She's 3 years old at the end of the day. And we also encourage her to learn Spanish and French as well. And so we
yes.
teach her like the basics. I know basics, basics Spanish, and I was at one point pretty good at French, and so I just teach her like basic things. And so just giving her languages to kind of play within her head. And I think as she gets older, she'll get more confident. My hope is that she'll get more confident. The reality, though, is that as the mom, I am the teacher. It's not
Mm,
a it's not anything my husband and I sat down and said, well, you're going to teach languages, but that's just what's happened naturally. And I find that a lot of my friends share that experience. Somehow the moms are the teachers. And so even though I don't speak Ndebele, I'm the one who's primarily trying to like make sure it's incorporated in a teacher. My husband speaks Ndebele, but I think he, for his own, reasons, he doesn't feel confident as a teacher. And so he tends to speak to her more in Shona because I speak Shona as well. So I think she hears more Shona at home than Ndebele. But we
okay.
have traveled to Zimbabwe with her twice. She went when she was 3 months old for 6 months. And
Wow.
then last year she went for a month. And so that is our goal, that at least annually, if we can, we take her back and she is around her people. She's hearing the language because all of that really helps. And so that's kind of our story. That's kind of how we do it. We are so lucky and blessed to be in a community where there are other Zimbabweans that we know.
Mm,
And, our friends are now starting to have kids. And so, one of the one of the things we do with one family is like when we get the kids together, we have time where we're going through Shona and we're doing, numbers and all of this stuff. And it's fun, and I think that's how we'll continue it. And now there are so many other people who are branching into this area of teaching Shona and Ndebele in particular. And so the resources have probably doubled since I started doing this. And when I started, I wasn't the first, right? And so there were already some people doing it. And so now there's been a huge influx of people doing this. There's people who do lessons over Zoom. There's people who have written books. There's people who've got animated stuff on YouTube, and so the resources are there. And I think it's just a matter, it is a movement. It's just a matter of, finding them and using them.
Wow. Wow. I mean, that's amazing to hear that, there's a multitude of resources available. Because it's awesome to have options and, for people to be able to choose, what's going to work best for them. I don't have children, so I guess I haven't really looked specifically for like Zambian local language books or resources, especially ones that are tailored to like children. But I would hope that those things exist because I think it's really important.
If they don't, you can always create one like I did.
Good point. Good point. Shoot, why not? Why
Why
not?
not?
Yeah, I think it's going to be really important, especially for like a lot of my peers, like my Zambian peers, who also will most likely have American children. It's like, how are we going to be, really intentional about making sure our children know how to speak the language? And so any tips, I guess, for people who, maybe they're married and they have a child, and like, is this, you said, you guys didn't officially have a conversation and say like, oh, my role is teaching and then your role is this. Like, do you think that would be like a helpful thing for people?
Yeah, good question. I think as far as tips for folks who want to teach their children or even maybe a spouse, I have a few based on my own observation and my research talking to other people. I think the research out there, first, I will say, is if you're trying to have a multilingual household, it's best if one person speaks one language to the child and the other speaks another language to the child. And so the child knows this parent is this language, this parent is that language. That's how the kids can learn. If you can't do that, then yeah, maybe have a conversation, or if you don't need to have a conversation per se, but like things will naturally flow in one way. Let's say the two spouses speak the same languages, then they speak three languages, but one is stronger in another, or the two of them are stronger in one particular one, then that's the language that is spoken, right? There's no like rule of thumb there or like best practice. I think in the end, you'll do what works best for you all. But as far as tips for teaching children specifically, I will say this. I say teach because for lack of a better word, but really it should be just incorporated into daily life. And it's not necessarily that, you start your day and you say, right, we're going to learn Shona today. You could do it that way, but the way I found was helpful and fun for both me and my child is just incorporating into daily life. And so in the morning, if we're going to brush our teeth, we'll sing a song in Shona and we're talking about brushing our teeth. I could even make up the song, it doesn't have to be a real song. And as we're going down the steps, we're counting, and guess what? We're going to count in Shona or Ndebele, and so we're just incorporating it that way. When we're outside and we're pointing and seeing what we're seeing, we're using, the native language and using those words. There was a time when my daughter didn't know certain animals in English because she only knew them in Shona. And so that time has passed. And she knows both now, is Shona and Ndebele, Shona and English rather. But yeah, just incorporating it into daily life because you want it to be fun. You don't want the kids to, like I was saying earlier, like you don't want to push them away because you're like forcing it down their throat, especially when they are maybe like my kid, very precocious. And so they can see and they start to understand that, hold on, these are not the languages I'm speaking in school. And so they start to push back a little bit when you say things in native language, right? So if you've got a precocious kid, you don't want to force this down their throat. You want to do it in a gentle, loving, fun way. And then I think the other thing to remember about children is they are way more intelligent than we are. That's just a fact. They are.
Yes.
And they can learn so many things. They can learn and absorb languages so much better than we can. And a lot of people say, oh, I don't want to confuse the child. I don't want them to not be able to speak English in the end or whatever. And, you know, some people do report, and this is real, speech delays in their children who are multilingual, and that's real. However, as far as confusing the child, I think the only confusion is, you know, maybe when they're trying to like sort it in their head, but it's not going to result in a long-term confusion. In the moment, yes, they might like be trying to like switch it, you know, on and off in their brains, but they can absorb. And between the ages of 1 and 5, those are the key years to really, you know, expose children, not just to languages, actually to a lot of things. Those are the key years in a child's development, 0 to 5. And so you want to, at that point in that window, really like give them the tools for success, because once they're older, you're going to start running into confidence stuff. You're going to start running into, well, what's cool and what's not, like we talked about, right? You're going to run into all these other things, attention. They're going to want to do other things. And so I think just remembering that kids are smart and giving them credit for that, and, you know, exposing them and seeing what sticks. And finally, I think, you know, if you have family that is in touch with the child or the children, have them talk to them in the languages. It's easier said than done, I know, at least with us, because the grandparents want to speak in English. That's just, they gravitate toward that, right? It's hard because most of us speak English, and that is just a fact, right? Most of us speak English, even if, you know, there's different degrees of fluency. We speak English. Why? Because that is the language of the world. That is the language of commerce. That is the language on TV. That is the language that we all speak. And so there is nothing wrong with your child speaking more English than your native language. And guess what? Especially when it comes to African languages, these languages are not a second option in school, like Spanish, for example, or German, some of the more mainstream non-African languages, right? There is no school I know of in this area that we live in Maryland, that teaches an African language as an option. All the options are European-based languages. And so that's real, right? And so you're the only one, you and your little community are the only ones who are teaching your child this language, right? And so that's an even harder thing to do. And so it is not going to be unusual that your child gravitates more toward English. That is, it just is what it is. And I think we just have to be okay with that and not beat ourselves up about that, right? And so those are some of the tips that I would share. And then obviously researching and seeing like what's out there, because there is a really big movement in preserving African languages in particular. And I know a lot of people who are working hard in this space to make sure that our languages are not lost. So the resources are out there. And like I said before, if they're not, you go ahead and create them like I did. Yes. If I can do it, anybody can do it, really. Yeah.
Absolutely. Wow. I mean, thank you for speaking to all of that. And especially, you know, you said there are different levels of fluency. Like I'm just now learning that, you know, receptive bilingual is a thing where it's like you only understand, but maybe you know, you don't know how to speak. And so I would put myself in that category, but I would say I'm at like very beginner level for my language Tonga.
Love it.
And so I guess it's like, do you think it's an unrealistic expectation that if you are an African living in the diaspora, that you will have children who can, like, should people put less pressure on themselves, or should there be like a very intentional effort to make sure that our children know our languages, can speak them? And that's
Mm,
probably a really hard question. I'm just like, I guess I'm kind
mm,
of thinking out loud.
that is a hard and it's a good question. And I'm going to give you an unsatisfactory answer, partly because I'm a lawyer. And so, and the answer is it'll depend. It's going to depend on each family, right? I think my goal and me being a culture, advocate is yes, there should be an intentional effort to preserve and teach our languages because honestly, if we don't do it, no one else is going to do it. And these languages will die, right? And with that, a lot of culture, tradition, etc. However, in terms of pressure, um, I don't think one needs to add an additional layer of pressure on themselves when you are already trying to just exist as a Black person, as an immigrant, in whatever part of the diaspora you find yourself in. And so I think we really need to give ourselves grace. And that's why I said it is okay if your child speaks more English. That's okay, right? They're not growing up being surrounded by Tonga or Shona or Nyanja or Bemba or whatever, right? They're just not. And so we have to start there and understand that this is not the same as a child who's growing up in the language and immersed in it, right? So giving ourselves grace. And I think until we have our languages in mainstream media and education, it's going to be always on us. So you have to make a choice as a parent or as a future parent. You know, do you want to do the work to help preserve the language and ensure that your children understand where they come from and who they are? Or do you want to leave it to kind of chance and whatever, And either there's no right answer, right? It's okay if you decide, you know what, this is too hard. That's
Mm.
okay. It's all okay. I think all of those things are fine. And so that's my like unsatisfactory answer, honestly, and I think just exposing our kids, something will land, it might not be fluency, but something will land, exposing our kids, taking them back to Africa, eating
Mm.
the food, like all of those things, those are all important parts. Language is not the most important part of culture and heritage, but it is an important part. And but food is too, right? Being on
Mm.
the soil is important too. And so I think you do your best. And guess what? Your kids are going to go through the same analysis. It'll be different for them, but they will go through that same analysis. And each generation has to go through its own analysis. And maybe our kids' generation is going to do even more than we are doing right now, right? And maybe they'll surpass us in terms of like creating all of these resources. But I think each generation does the best that it can with the resources that it has, and that is okay. And so no fault to our parents' generation for doing what they did and the best that they could in that time. No fault to us. It's okay. It's all okay.
Yes, indeed, indeed. I love that. I really love that. And like even like for my mom, sometimes I don't want to say I've been hard on her, but I've really
You've
asked
been
like
hard on her.
I've really asked like mom, like why wasn't there like an intentional effort to make sure that we really knew how to speak these languages? Because for me, like I've just always had a curiosity and interest. If my mom's, on the phone with my grandma, I'm listening because I'm like, oh, they're speaking Tonga. Like this is awesome. Or, even now I'm like, okay, mom, like, okay, let's just speak in Tonga. Like we'll start and then it goes back to English, which is fine. But I love that you said that, they did the best they could with the resources they had. For someone like my mom, it's not like she was a stay-at-home mom who maybe had a bit more time to like dedicate to like, okay, let's learn the animals. Like that wasn't
Mhm.
um that wasn't a thing, but she was very intentional about making sure we traveled back home as often as we could. We
Mhm.
ate and shima. In other ways, she did
Yeah.
make sure that we remained connected to our culture. And just because that didn't exist doesn't mean that she didn't try.
Mm.
And obviously, if I'm still really curious about my language and making sure I learn it, she probably did something right. If she didn't, then this curiosity wouldn't exist
Yeah.
anyway. So
Yeah. Yeah.
thank you for speaking to that. Yes, could you share more about my first book of Shona and Ndebele words?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Let's give it up to the moms, first of all, based on what you were sharing. So I created this book as a resource, kind of as I said before, to really, I created it really thinking about my own child and looking for resources to build her library. And my husband and I have always been very intentional about the stuff we consume in this house, from what we eat to what we watch and what we listen to and what we read. And so we were intentional and looked for a book like this and didn't find one that was to my kind of satisfaction in terms of quality and all of that, right? And so I set out to create my own, and this book really is, it's been a labor of love, and really propelled by the birth of my daughter. I'd always wanted to be an author, but without her impending arrival into this world, I probably wouldn't have written a book. And I never envisioned writing a children's book, but I had to for her. And I did it also, like I was telling you before, to be very, very intentional about portraying Zimbabwe, portraying Africa. And when I started doing research and learning that children's books don't really feature Black characters, most actually feature an animal before they would feature a Black character, I was really enraged by that. And then when I realized that, in children's literature, most people who write books are not women, they're not Black women, all these things really like empowered me to be like, well, I'm going to change that. And so I did write this book. And yeah, it represents so much. It represents going after a dream, going after a vision. It represents doing something and taking imperfect action, which is something I always say to people now, is just take imperfect action. Like, I'm not a native Ndebele speaker, but I wrote this book and it's okay, and there will be people who say, and I have a big disclaimer at the beginning of the book, well, this dialect isn't wrong, right? And you should have used this word instead. And I'm like, listen, there are so many dialects in Zimbabwe, Shona dialects. And so if you are not satisfied with the word choice, replace it with the dialect you would want to use instead, right? Or you can also go and write your own book in your dialect.
Amen.
But yeah, and so take imperfect action, go after your dreams. If you see a problem, do something about it, be the change you want to see, all of that stuff. That's what this book represents. And at the core of it, it is about just how proud I am to be Zimbabwean, and I wanted to pass that on to my child. And like you said about your own mom, if she did other things not so great or not so well, the fact that you are still curious and you still want and are eager to learn means she did something right. And that's really all that I want to, is like, I just want to pass that on, my love for where I'm from, and pride in who I am. I want to pass that on. And I also wanted to have a physical copy of something that my daughter can pass down to her kids and her kids and her kids, like my own little legacy in this way, and bottle it up, and so that was also the impetus behind the book.
Wow. That is such a gift, and I'm sure as she gets older, she'll, appreciate it that much more. So shout out to you for being able to put that together, and just, identifying like a need and just doing something about it. How have people like responded to the book, and what's maybe surprised you?
I think people they've been overwhelmingly very receptive to the book and very excited about it. I think the biggest surprise probably has been that the fact that people, not just Zimbabweans, but people, period, have been excited about it. And there was a time where I would do so many shipments to Australia of
Wow.
this book. Australia was killing it. Australia was killing it. And a couple weeks ago, I had an order for the ebook. You know, it's just, you know, you download and you pay it on the website from Japan. And I
No
was just like,
way. That
and
is incredible.
it wasn't a name that I recognized. It wasn't someone I know. It was, and I just thought, this is just so like it blows my mind. And you know, I was telling you that I never planned for any of this. I mean, look, I get to meet you. How would I have ever met you? You know, and so this book has blown my mind. It has created its own path and it has directed me in what I'm supposed to be doing because I had one thought and it has directed me in like, nope, we're going to do it this way. You're going to, you know, be on national Zimbabwe news. You know, I didn't plan for that. You're going to be in the papers. I didn't plan for any of that stuff. And so that has been, I think, the biggest shock is just how it has evolved into its own thing. And I kind of am like going with the flow, you know, really at the end of the day.
Love it. Love it. And I think when we spoke earlier, you mentioned that even people who may not necessarily identify as Zimbabweans are still buying the book just out of curiosity and appreciation
Yeah.
for, you know, African languages. Um, did you expect that before you know, launched the book or?
No, no. If I tell you what I expected and what I thought, you will laugh. But I'm gonna share, okay? I'm among a friend here. So, you know.
Yes.
Um, honestly, I thought that I would write this book and maybe like 20 people would get it. 20, 30, maybe, you know. That's real. That's just what I thought. When I was creating it, that's really what I thought. I didn't think that anyone would like, who cares? I thought that people would be, and some people have taken this view, which is, well, I'm Zimbabwean already and I speak these languages, and why do I need a book? You know? And so, yeah, I didn't know what to expect. And so, yes, absolutely, that has completely blown my mind. And I think we're in an age where people are not comfortable anymore, and the world has made them uncomfortable as well, being in their own little bubbles, and they really want to explore. And I have a lot of customers who come back to me, you know, Caucasian folks, white folks, who are like, this is my kid's favorite book. You know, and I'm just like, wow, you know, because the images are beautiful and, you know, all of that. And so, yeah, it's blown my mind. It just has. I didn't expect that at all. But I'm happy and I'm really proud of the book. I'm really proud of what it's doing and what I hope it will continue to do. And yeah.
Wow, that is incredible. And where can people go buy the book? Is it available in different formats or?
Yeah. Yeah. My favorite question. People can buy the book on my website, which is Pelisa Creatives. I'm sure it'll be in the notes. They can also buy it on Amazon, of course. They can buy it. If you're in Zimbabwe, you can buy it, a physical copy, in various stores in Zimbabwe, which we'll share as well. But the two primary places are Amazon and then on my website. And an ebook is available for download. And we are working on an audiobook. So super excited to get that out, so that people can actually just hear how the words are pronounced as they read the book. So that's coming. Stay tuned for that.
Love it, love it. And yes, absolutely. I will make sure all those links are included. Um, wow, it's just so incredible that you've been able to put this together and the impact is like, you know, way beyond your initial expectations. And usually that's how a lot of these things work. It's like, we're like, oh, I just, a few people are going to listen. And then it's like,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
people really surprise you. And
Yeah.
yes. And do you see yourself, expanding beyond the two languages, or maybe just providing maybe like books for like older children? Like, is that something that you're thinking through?
Yeah, I'm definitely thinking through continuing the journey. This is not the end. And so I really want, and the mission of my company, Police of Creatives, is to celebrate and amplify Black and African stories. And so I'll continue to do that. How exactly, I'm still working on a few things, but definitely look out for more. This is only the beginning.
Love it. Love it. Wow. And I guess I haven't asked this question in a while, but what would you say excites you the most about Africa's future? Let's start there.
Mm. Wow. What excites me the most about Africa's future is just observing this next generation, you know. Um, I think they will transform systems that have been for a long time broken, like we were talking about. And they are exposed to more than any other generation. And so I think they will create a truly united Africa, and they will achieve so much more than we could ever imagine. So like my daughter and her peers, I think that's really what excites me. These are kids who are growing up all over the world, and my hope is that through some of the work that we're doing, some of the work you're doing, right, we can instill this pride in them no matter where they grow up, so that they always know that Africa is home at the end of the day, and they do things to make Africa better. That's kind of what excites me, I think, the most.
Absolutely. Yeah. Definitely appreciative of the work that you're doing and others in the space to ensure that, children are, connected to their cultures and they're learning languages, and they're, being just exposed to new ideas, new languages. Thank you again so much for being a guest
Thank you.
on Dear Diaspora.
Thank you for having me. I love what you're doing. Continue doing it. And I'm so glad we are connected. I wish you all the best. I really do. And I hope that we remain in touch and we continue to collaborate. We continue to celebrate the African diaspora because it deserves celebration.
I hope you enjoyed the episode. Be sure to check out her book, My First Book of Shona and Ndebele Words. The links to that are in the episode description. You can buy it on Amazon or on her website. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Be sure to follow this podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is out, and that's every 2 weeks. New episodes are released on a bi-weekly schedule now. You can now support the show by buying us a coffee. Be as generous as you'd like. All of your support goes right back into growing the podcast and supporting the creatives behind the show. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll talk to you soon. Before you go, if you are listening on Apple Podcasts, please leave us a review and rate the show. It means so much. And I was just looking the other day and noticed most of the reviews on there are from 2019. So I would really, really appreciate some new reviews. So please do show us some love and leave a review. Let us know what you think of the show. Even just a rating makes a huge difference. So thank you so much for doing that.